give me a cue.
That's it.
I want to thank all of you for coming to this. As I suggested when we announced that we were going to do this professional learning community, I'm sure that a lot of what I'm going to cover today is old stuff for you. So for some of you, it'll be a review. For some of you, maybe it'll be new, but I certainly hope that you get a lot out of it today. But I also want to make sure that the agenda is driven by your needs. So, you know, if we start talking about something and we're not going the direction that you'd really like to go, then let's go your direction. So don't just follow along. Can you move the slide to the next one?
Okay, let's see.
You did a clicker?
Yeah, I think you just give it a touch.
So here are the objectives that I came up with today. Looking at a lesson plan, we're gonna see kind of a historical trend to lesson planning, and I think that we get a little twisted in how complicated we can make this process, and I've tried to simplify it down to the essential parts of the lesson, and there are 4 of them, and so we'll show you those. We're going to look at the effective design of a lesson and see that it's not a very linear process. And so, you know, kind of the organic structure of it, I think, is very helpful. We're going to look at lesson targets. Typically, those are called, you know, lesson objective, but there's other ways to view that, and so you can kind of experiment with the way that you are most comfortable. We're going to look at assessment and purposes of assessment. And you know, overall, we're going to consider the elements of a well-designed lesson and how it should be delivered, so that the students walk away with. Lesson planning. We're going to start there. How do you write an effective lesson plan? This is where I started back in the 1970s. Madeline Hunter was an educator from University of California, LA. And she came up with the 7-step lesson plan. I never even knew exactly what an anticipatory set was, but there it is, and I had to do it every day on a lesson plan. This is nuts. So we're not going here, okay? Except I would mention that whether you write out a formal lesson plan, or whether you just kind of have it in your head, you do these steps. All right. So we'll not forget the steps. Here's my model for the organic lesson plan that I would propose would be most effective for you. There's really 3 things in a lesson plan that must tie together and coordinate. And the first is your learning target. You know, where do you want to go? The next one is the assessment to measure the learning target. And the third is the activity that gets the students to success on the assessment to indicate that they've met the target. And all of this is predicated on who the learner is. So that's why I have the learner in the middle and those other things. And the reason I use the triangle is that I want to indicate that this process is not a linear process. For example, might be driving to work and thinking about a future lesson. And you know, I kind of know what my topic is, and we tend to teach from topics rather than targets, and that doesn't get us where we want to go. I know what my topic is, and so I start thinking of, I have this activity. I've done it for a number of years, and the students really like it. So what I need to then do is I need to make sure that that activity is useful to getting students to a particular learning target, and that I have some sort of assessment to find out whether that activity actually in fact got them there. So I can start from the activity. Perhaps I have an assessment that is very precise at determining the level of success that students have in teaching a particular target. So I'm starting the design of my lesson around my assessment. That's called backward design, and you know, beginning with the end in mind is kind of, I think, what I'm suggesting might be useful to us. It's also possible that I know what I want to teach, and now I need to make sure that that target is appropriate. There's lots of stuff that students can do. The question is whether they should do it. I have a little form here that I find particularly useful and thought-provoking in terms of what we teach. Pass them down.
All right.
And so you'll notice these concentric circles. Starting at the third level, these are things we teach that are kind of interesting, and maybe they're worthwhile for the students to know. Moving to the center circle, number 2, these are things that are important for the students to know. Into the center of this target, and these are your essential learning. This is the enduring information that students must know. I'd like you to reflect a moment on the content that you teach in any one of your classes, and think about how you might be able to parse out that information that you're teaching into one of those 3 categories. I'd like to share a little bit about your content and what you really think students must know versus those kinds of things that are important or even just interesting.
Like what kind of things we would put in these circles?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just jotting down my ideas.
Okay.
And for me, as an English teacher, to seem probably, I have something to say about this too, but I just have, in one, the must know is just having a point and defending it well. So having a thesis, knowing how to organize your argument.
Mm-hmm.
Important to know would be argumentative styles.
Okay.
So different ways to argue that. And then the third would be topical content and global perspectives.
Very
So it'd
good.
be nice for them to be informed and global citizens, but
Mhm.
what I'm really trying to teach them is just how to defend their points.
Yes.
That's what I need to communicate.
Okay. Anybody else?
Well, I think step 3, what he's saying is, for instance, Nathan, I was just teaching Food for Thought by Shauna Sequeira. I'm sure you,
I don't know if I'm familiar with it.
it's a book, it's an anthology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there's, of course, first, what is basic and topical, and that information. What would I want my students to know about that topic that they could not possibly afford to miss? So, it was, interestingly, an Indian woman's perspective on the American culture and its relationship to food. And so the baseline is that, you develop from there. But then there are things to know about the American people and their relationship to food, which would not be very pivotal to the topic itself, but would nonetheless be useful
Mhm.
and interesting. And then there is the general understanding and the familiarity, as I said, cultural concepts across the board, the global perspectives, which they would really enjoy. And yesterday, it kind of just, I let them speak, and I thought they generated some very interesting questions for me. So I think I basically hit all 3 of those areas in my lesson.
And I think you should.
Mm-hmm.
The question really comes down to when you're assessing the students, are you assessing them in that number 3 circle? Or are you assessing them in that number 1 circle? Because when they walk out of your class, you need to make sure that they own number 1.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, number 3 is the fun stuff usually.
Yes.
You know, when I was teaching about the American Revolution, I used to teach about George Washington, and fundamentally, essentially, in that circle number 1, this country wouldn't exist without George Washington. For an 11th or 12th grader, who cares? And so I would try to bring in some aspects of George Washington that made him a real person. For example, he was famous for being an excellent dancer.
We didn't know that.
Yeah. And the women all kind of jockeyed to be able to dance with him.
Mhm.
When you look at the famous portraits of Washington, he has red cheeks. Why does he have red cheeks in the paintings? Remember that an artist, he gets to kind of do his own photoshopping. And actually, Washington's face was rather badly scarred from smallpox when he was a teenager. And so that's the reflection of that. When he walked in the room, he was the one everybody gravitated toward, largely because he was a tall man. He was about 6'4", and that was really unusual back then, when the average height of a person was about 5'8". So he towered over people. And that's all really interesting and completely non-essential.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're teaching, you want to use those things to make sure you get those learners down into that essential level, okay? And I don't know whether I ever did that with those stories. We'll move on. Well, we're going to focus for a moment on the learner. Because fundamentally, how you teach is going to be driven by who is sitting in front of you. You have to get to know them. And this is a real challenge when you only have those students once or twice a week for a relatively short period of time. They breeze in, they breeze out, an hour and a half or 3 hours. That challenge becomes even more acute when you're teaching an ICR and you don't actually see anything but a virtual image of that student.
Yeah.
Or an online class where if that student walked into your office 3 weeks into the semester, you wouldn't even know who that student was until he or she introduced themselves to you. So it's a challenge that we've got to overcome, because without information about the students, you're going to be hamstrung in how effectively you can transmit the content over to them. So how do you learn about students? Hold on a word, I ask them. The way I would suggest that you go about that is not a face-to-face grilling, but you can begin your classes with different inventories that you think would be of some use to learning who they are. In a moment, I'm going to have you actually find some of those because they're quite easy to find online. Before we get to that part, though, we don't want to overlook the fact that while the stuff that you're going to find with these inventories is important and essential, it may not get you to the piece of information that's absolutely fundamental is how good a student are they? Could you now, and I'm suggesting that you probably could you now take a roster of the students in your class and rank them academically? I'll make that a rhetorical question. Could you group them academically? These are my best students, and these are my lowest students, and these are my middle students. That might be a little easier, and it's extremely useful.
Well, yeah, because I have numbers.
Numbers, oh, you mean like test scores and
Yeah,
things like that?
'cause
Sure.
I have numbers.
Right, but you see, you don't have those initially in the class. So, we're, what, 10 weeks into a semester, I'm guessing?
13.
13? Okay.
Who's counting?
But who's counting? So, I would absolutely think that you would know that. And I would challenge you, is there anybody in that roster that you really couldn't? It's like, I don't really know how well that student does. I always had those people. Those are the little nuggets that you really need to get in and find out, why don't you know anything about that student? Okay. So here's what I'd like you to do, is I would like for you to go online and just do a Google search. There's a couple of ways to do these inventories. First of all, you could just Google student inventories and see what comes up. I had no idea. You could look for multiple intelligence inventories. Are we familiar with the multiple intelligences concept? Howard Gardner?
Yeah.
7 to 9, logical, mathematical,
Yes.
verbal, linguistic, kinesthetic, and so forth. Those would be worth looking into, and we could probably do a little professional development on that as well. We can go overboard with that a little bit too. So you could look at multiple intelligence inventory. Student interest surveys would be another Google search term. So pick one of those and see what you can come up with, and look it over and be ready to kind of talk about it for the group. Have you found any? Raymond, what did you find? Where did you get there?
Well, I found, I probably looked through the first 10 or so that just showed up in a Google search.
Mhm.
And some of them were, apparently there's a market for these, because a lot of them were,
You have to pay for them?
yes. So I,
There's a lot of free ones out there, too.
Went to the free ones.
Yeah.
And I tried to find ones that asked about the questions that would help me teach them better, because some of them had questions about things that were just, I would think, fun things to know about people.
Mhm.
But this one was pretty good when it asked just direct questions like, what are your favorite classes and why?
Mhm.
And
Can I
what,
stop you there for a second?
Sure.
You know, when you think about it, and you get 20 people walk into your classroom, 10 of them don't like your subject. You think that's important to know who that is? Absolutely. So that's a great question.
You
what
think they're gonna tell you?
Yeah, in a survey like that, sure.
what extracurricular activities do you participate in? That could be helpful, because they might be engaged in music or something else
Exactly.
that would allow me to emphasize certain things in lessons that would pique their interest. How do you like to learn, by myself, with a friend, or in a small group? That's a good question.
Yes.
If you get a class that answers in a small group mostly, that gives you may redo your whole,
Your lesson plan.
yeah.
Mhm.
Instead of making it even or leaning one way or the other, you can really lean that way
Yes.
if that's an honest answer.
Absolutely.
Sometimes students will answer certain types of questions in ways that are not as honest as others. They
Mhm.
like that they might mislead you with certain types of questions without even trying to.
Sure.
And you may plan a strategy that fails because it isn't exactly, it's based on faulty information.
Yeah.
But,
Absolutely.
and there are more examples here. I do like this idea,
Yeah.
especially if it's something they can do relatively quickly and that you can read relatively quickly.
Mhm.
Because you're getting this at the beginning of your semester,
Mhm.
most likely, and you're anxious to do content and to do the syllabus and all the things you're supposed to cover.
Mhm.
And at the most, you could use this to change. I would think I'm thinking of my subject area, you could change how you do do your lessons, but your content is going to stay largely the same,
Mhm.
but you can use this to tweak certain moments.
Mhm.
I
Absolutely.
mean, I couldn't just scrap the whole plan for the year because students in this one semester have a certain preference that's indicated, but I would certainly use that every chance I could in how I work with them in terms of maybe activities.
Mhm.
But the content would be less, it'd be harder to tweak
Mhm.
when the semester is beginning.
Let me address that comment though about kind of scrapping a year's plan because your students kind of lean one way or the other in their style of learning. For example, we'll take the group thing. The students say, "Oh, I hate working in groups." And by the way, that's typically common, especially at the higher ed level. Those students have worked in groups since they were in kindergarten, and group work is awful for them because they ended up doing all the work and the other 3 people in the group did nothing. Somebody characterized it as 2 do nothing and 1 sabotages the work. So when they get to our level, they're kind of against it. And then you planned a semester where you're going to have them do all kinds of group projects. Don't throw it out. Okay. Those group projects can be tailored so that it's less of a everybody sinks or swim because one person does all the work, and you put them together so that all the group assignments are a collection of 4 individual efforts put together. And there's a way to do that. The reason is that there is almost nothing that you can do in your classroom that won't improve a student with a weakness in that area, or allow that student to work in an area in which they're strong. So if you change your instructional techniques throughout the semester, every student has a time when they're working in an area in which they struggle, or every time somebody is working in an area in which they feel comfortable.
Excel,
Okay, so you don't want to always match their learning preferences, because that won't help them grow and stretch. Did anybody find multiple intelligences? Anybody look that one up? What'd you find?
I just went through there was a PDF of like, of a thing to check off, you check off things that you agree with.
Yeah,
And,
and then you score it.
yeah, and it is really interesting.
Yeah,
And this helps me because my dream is to create a class that's like totally empowering to the student, where they kind of get to design their own version of the class.
Mhm.
And I'm already thinking about using this as like,
Mhm.
because I'm trying to lean more towards like, I don't tell you what to read, you tell me what you are reading.
Mhm.
And I don't tell you what this paper's gonna be about, you tell me what you're gonna write about.
Mhm.
And I think this is like a good way to get into that. Because
And-
I think a lot of students don't realize how they think,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like, I just found out I'm a 4, and it's like, I'm totally a 4, I'm totally that existential, philosophical, analyzer person.
just to give you a little background on Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence. Howard Gardner, well, he is an educator. His background is really psychology, and he's a researcher at Harvard University. And in the 80s, he came up with this idea of multiple intelligences in his book, Frames of Mind. At the time, there were 7 of them. He's expanded to 9. Existential is one of them. The list is kind of jockey, so number 4 on one list might be number 5 on another list. They usually start with the 2 that schools are structured around, which are verbal linguistic and logical mathematical. But not every student is strong in those 2 areas. Every student can function in all 7 to 9 areas, but some areas are stronger than others. You won't find a student on an assessment like that won't score something on any of them, okay? But they'll find some areas that they score highly on. While your logical mathematical students who are bodily kinesthetic, who are low in verbal linguistic, struggle with your class, okay? I was not a particularly logical mathematical person. I struggled with math.
Me too.
Okay, so, and nobody knew about that when I was learning, and nobody cared. We can parse this out, and again, getting back to my point, the fact that somebody comes into your class who's not high in that verbal linguistic simply means they have an opportunity to strengthen that area.
And I use that too, and now that I have like this tool too that I can use it, but that's what I do with those math-minded people, is I turn it into a math problem for them.
Mhm.
Like a paper is just a math problem like anything else.
Sure.
It has a 1 + 1 = 3, but
Sure.
it's words instead of numbers.
You know, a spatial intelligence can see writing as a pattern,
Yeah.
okay? So, there's lots of ways to use this in all of your subject areas. Anybody find anything else that they want to share that they find?
I've got this questionnaire here on multiple intelligence here, and I'm just filling it out as assessment of your strengths.
Mhm.
And finding your strong points in different parts of life. So I'm just filling it out.
There are many of the MI ones that are interactive, and when you get to the end and you hit the submit, it'll give you a chart that'll have it all totaled up, and it'll have some little explanation of who you are. What you'll also find,
But if you
being
don't
who you
mathematical
are,
and logical, that chart's not gonna make any sense to you.
I'm sorry?
If you're not mathematical and logical, that chart's not gonna make any sense to
Well, that might be a good point. What you'll find at your level is that your results are fairly even, because you've had those opportunities all through your life to work in those areas in which you struggled and you mastered them, you got here. Your students are going to be much more diverse than you are, but it is interesting just to kind of look at that. So what do you do with this information? Well, as Brandon was talking about, you can tailor your lessons and your assignments with that information. You can do it on a weekly basis, or you can kind of look at it over the course of your semester. You can talk about this a little later, but as you look at your class and you think in terms of your final assessment, does everybody have to take the same one? The answer to that question is no.
Well, if I want any usable data, they do.
No, that's not true. You can design an assessment, several assessments that measure the same thing in different ways. Because in the end, what you want to know is not whether or not they can survive your assessment. You want to know if they know the content. And that's best measured in multiple ways. You can use this information to create learning groups. So you can make your groups homogeneous in terms of interest, gender, multiple intelligences, or you can make them heterogeneous, so that every group has somebody who kind of meets several criteria. You can focus the support that you use in your class. When students come to you and say they're struggling, if you know that student well, you can use examples, you can use activities that will better match that student. So let's get a kind of a little feel for what that might look like for you in your classroom. I handed you 20 students in the little packet there. And the descriptions of the students really run the gamut. And what I'd like you to do is just pick a couple of those students, just two, and tell me how the description on there is going to drive how you might instruct that student or support that student. Have you seen any of those students in your classes?
Probably think every one of them is.
Sure. You've had them all, and you may not have known it.
Yes. Well, if you taught for 37 years, you're bound to have met somebody like that. So yeah, I can relate to a lot of these.
But tell me how you take two of those students and use this information to help tailor their instruction. Help make them more successful in your class. Nathan, can I put you on the spot a bit? Have you,
Sure. Yeah, I just kind of picked two at random. I've definitely had these two people. The first one, Noble, tries to be the center of attention, answers questions but isn't often right. Likes to be called on to read but doesn't read well. Does have good comprehension skills when reading, average grades, gets C or higher on those 10s. Writes in very simple, spells erratically. Taking classes as part of court order to avoid jail. Likes to be a leader. This is like the kind of the spats, right? But Noble is like my best tool because students who have that much enthusiasm, you can like harness that and use that to rein everyone else in.
Mhm.
And then I usually try to do that is like, and you know, they're kind of the class clown too, so they're good for humor. And then I usually try to use that interaction to also kind of rein them in because it's usually a focus problem.
Mhm.
So try to get them to focus a little more on what they're doing.
yeah,
And at the same time as utilize them as a kind of a unification tool.
yes.
Because I've noticed that if you have, it only takes one student with high enthusiasm to elevate the rest of the class.
Absolutely.
So it's as
And
long
vice
as-
versa.
Yeah.
And really, he wants attention.
Yeah.
He craves it,
Yeah.
okay? And sometimes, all you need to do for a student that craves attention is to teach here, okay? And he knows that he's getting some attention, even though he's saying nothing.
Mhm.
Right? So now I can have my better readers read,
Mhm.
and he's okay with that, because he knows I'm meeting his need.
Gotcha.
Okay. Another way to kind of improve that reading skill is to front load it. So say, I'm gonna have you read this passage tomorrow in class. Can you kind of practice that tonight? All right? So, you know, he doesn't struggle through reading, okay? I'm not a big proponent, by the way, of having students read in class. They're not very good at it, and the other students tune out. If reading needs to be done in your class, you should be doing it. Just like you do. Let's do another activity with this. This is a little bit more challenging. What I'd like you to do is to take those 20 students and put them into 4 groups. I am not going to give you any more direction than that. you're finding some of them don't fit nicely into your
Yeah.
group. They're people.
Yes. We have some overlaps in some areas, but not quite the typical star to qualified group.
Yeah, for my science types, this isn't very scientific. Kevin, how would you title your 4 categories?
I'm trying to figure out the folks who are struggling the most and find some leadership to go along with those groups.
Okay.
And then so if he's got strong leadership, maybe to help out, put the really bad students with the really good students, but some of the middle of the road ones with some of the leadership.
Oh, okay. So your groups are heterogeneous.
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
crazy mix, because I
Okay.
don't want this group over here feel like they're my B team.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to spread them out as even as possible.
Okay.
And trying to pull out the people that, like I said, have a little bit of leadership and or educational background or really strong in math to help out the other guys and help pull the rest of the team up.
So as you went through this process, I'm assuming that what you did is the first thing you did is you kind of went through and said, well, who are my 4 leaders?
And I haven't found them all yet. I said,
Yeah.
I did a quick scan, so I found a couple, I knew, hey, this was really strong.
Yeah.
So it'll take a little more time to get them all
Absolutely.
lined up the way I want them.
And you could resort them on the last day of class.
I know.
Okay. Nathan, it looks like you're all over the place there. Have you got 4 categories in hand?
Well, I
in your
was
head?
I was going for the ones I normally kind of group them into, but I have my warriors who are fine. They just need reassured that
Okay.
they're doing okay.
Mhm.
And then I have my just good students who are there to do the work and
Mhm.
just need that guidance. Then I have my spazzes, the ones who are kind of all over the place.
Yeah, you
just
probably need
grading
another
it.
term for that.
Yeah, that's it's an endearing. I consider it an endearing thing, but see what you're saying. My excitable, Kevin was saying, the ones who can be leaders, the ones you can utilize and tap in for that energy.
Yep.
And
So
then
you've got 4 categories in mind, and now it's just a matter of making them fit somehow.
Yeah.
Okay. What are your 4 categories, Brent?
These are the students who are achievers or above achievers.
Okay.
These are ones who are just average.
Uh-huh.
These are ones who struggle, and these are failures.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's what that's what I tried to group me the best I could.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I have this philosophy that we spend so much time at 2 ends that we lose the ones in the middle, and that our average learners are the ones who are most at risk because they don't get what they need. And doing this kind of an activity helps us isolate those people so we can spend some time with them. That doesn't mean that you aren't going to spend time with those other 2 ends because they need it. But we tend to do that at the expense of the middle. Chuck, what were your categories?
I distributed them randomly because that's the way life is.
Okay. And that'll work if you kind of know who's in there and make sure that you kind of can meet those needs. So we go through this exercise and we begin to start thinking about who are those 20 or so students in front of us, so that we can better meet their educational needs as we move along. I think we make a mistake when we turn our focus the other way and look solely at our content and what needs to be taught, irrespective of who those people are that we're teaching. And I would postulate that a lot of the people who aren't as successful as we would like are not successful because we didn't meet their learning needs. And we can have that debate about whether that's our job or not. I think it is. When we do this deep dive into who they are, using those tools, then we're able to do a better job with this. So let's move to target. And here this is critical. We tend as teachers to know so much about our content that we don't spend enough time trying to determine what that center circle is all about. Because it's all important for us, because we own it. And what we need to remember is our students are still new at this, new at your content, and they don't need to know it all, and they can't get there anyway. So we're going to focus what we're asking our students to do by actually identifying our learning target. And think of the target as the destination in a trip. So, you say to your students, we're going to take a trip. And they'll go, hey, great, let's go. At some point, somebody needs to ask, wait, how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
So if we specify our target is national, that's all well and good, but there are students in your classroom that have no idea where Nashville is. Couldn't come within 1,000 miles of Nashville on a map. Can't get to that target. Your job is to create the routes that they might take. There's how do we get rid of this up here?
I think, let's see. Good clearing.
There's three types of target. The first one is the traditional behavioral objective that Madeline Hunter, that I showed that initial lesson plan that she came up, this is exactly what she would want, and she'd want nothing less. A behavioral objective starts with something like, and I've used a shorthand here, and I suggest you do too. The learner will, that's what TLW means, write an editorial with 3 factual statements supporting their thesis. Short, succinct. Will you know when they've done it? Absolutely. Because you have a piece of paper in front of you with a student's name that has a thesis statement and 3 supporting facts.
These are 3 strategies for the same lesson, correct?
Yes. There are 3 targets. It's essentially the same target, just stated in different ways. So the first one is very stilted, technical teacher jargon. After 40-some years in this field, I'm pretty comfortable with that. But I absolutely hate writing objectives that way. The next way to do it is to actually pose an essential question. Think in terms of that smaller circle. Essentially, what must a student know for today's lesson? Okay? What are the elements of an effective written editorial? Okay? So there's a question mark at the end. And at the end of the class, if you were to say, Tassine, can you tell me what the elements of an effective editorial are? And she can. I won't put you on the spot, although I'm sure you could. If she can respond to my question, I've met my objective. Okay? The third way, and I find this just a little bit young. I've used this for younger students, but it might work for you. They're called I can statements. I can write an editorial using multiple facts to support my thesis, my point of view. So what this does is it turns it into student language. And that really kind of takes me to the next point there. You should share these objectives with your students. When they're sitting in the class, they probably cannot articulate, but somewhere rushing around their brain is, what the heck am I doing here? What's important? What am I supposed to learn? What am I supposed to take away? And we don't respond to that, we just keep throwing stuff
I
at them.
totally agree.
Yeah.
I had a few students with that look last night in the US history course.
Yeah,
When I see it, I try to state a purpose so they can see what the purpose of it is, but
Mhm.
it would be nice to have it just clearly provided, maybe somewhere in a visual, maybe you just write it on a board or
post
have
it,
it.
post it right on your
It's
board,
in-
put it on your PowerPoint.
They're all in the syllabus theoretically, but they need to probably see it,
Yeah.
visualize it.
Right.
And-
Don't we do it just instinctively sometimes, you know, when we're trying to put a point across to our students? I find myself saying this sometimes. Well, the reason I'm doing this is because, or the point I'm trying to make it, put it across to you is because of this.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But as you do that during the lesson, you're kind of taking the overall objective and now you're focusing on a piece of that. Okay, so if I'm looking at my objectives, I'm gonna have to spend some time teaching them about supporting statements, how to find them, how to use them, how to write them into the text that I'm having them do. And that's only part of my objective. Because my terminal objective is that they actually can put the whole thing together. So when I'm talking about factual statements, the reason I'm talking about factual statements is because I want you to be able to go to some source and use that. See, but that's only down there at the bottom and I still haven't done the top. So in order for them to put that piece into the whole, we start our class with, this is what we're gonna accomplish today. I did that at the very beginning of our workshop. I gave you my objectives today, okay? So share them with the students. One of the things that makes this useful for students, and you know, we can kind of get back to this for a moment, is when the class is over, and several classes are over, and it's time for you to assess, and the students are going to study, they really don't know what the heck to study. This is especially true in history, because we just throw a lot of facts out. You know, how many times have you heard, oh, history, I didn't like history, it's just a bunch of names and dates. We use a lot of names and dates, but that's never the essential part of what we're teaching.
Exactly.
They didn't get the point. Well, why didn't they get the point? Because I didn't tell them what the point was. And so when they go to study, they're up in that, you know, in that third box trying to study everything instead of trying to focus on the essential things. Now, I can feed that if I'm going to give them a 75-point multiple choice test with all that trivia. Just how tall was George Washington? Which is totally irrelevant.
Yeah.
And I can really make my assessment much shorter and focus on what I need them to know. If I know what that is, if I've got a target in mind, if I've taken the time to do that target. So I'm going to ask you, if you would right now, to actually think about, wait a minute, I'm not there yet. Oh, I guess I am.
You want to do that? All of those?
I'm going to do some target hints, and then I'm going to have you do this. Oops, went too far. Are you helping me there?
No, I'm just coping.
Okay. The first thing you need to do is make sure that your target is terminal learning and not just an activity. I've given some of this information out before. I think, you know, you're pretty familiar with it. This is Bloom's taxonomy, sorry. Try not to hit you in the nose with that. This is Bloom's taxonomy done two ways on each side of the sheet of paper. Remember that Bloom's taxonomy has
You're
the
supposed to pass something.
So, I get so lost in it.
has the five hierarchical levels of learning from, you know, down low is knowledge, and up high is creating. You can tailor the learning target verbs to your Bloom's level. But those verbs also work for activities. So in my target, remember, they're gonna write an editorial. If I just said they're gonna write an editorial, that would be an activity. But because I specified what has to be in that editorial, I've turned an activity into a terminal objective. This is extremely nuanced, okay? And I would suggest that you're gonna play around with this and start actually focusing on your objectives for your classes, and feel free to send one or two to me just to find, you know, another pair of eyes to say, is this terminal or is this an activity? Because when we use Bloom's taxonomy, the lines get a little blurred. Another thing that I want you to avoid are these terms. The learner will understand how photosynthesis works. The learner will learn how to write an effective editorial. The learner will know the causes of the American Revolution. Now, what's problematic about that is that you cannot measure those words. You won't know when a student understands anything. You won't know what they know. You don't know if they learned it until they've done something else. They've explained it to you. They've demonstrated it. They've written something. So those become your action words. Explaining, demonstrating, and writing. Not understand, know, and learn. Okay. This is the soft target we all go to. And it's just imprecise. But it might be a place to start. Give me back. Sorry, I touched it.
Let's see here.
I got it.
Okay.
And the last thing is, we tend to put compound sentences together as targets. Let's see, I think I have an example here. The students will research and write. Okay. The problem is that they might be successful at one and not the other, and you won't know the difference with one target. So maybe they can write, but they haven't got anything to say. They haven't done the appropriate research.
Yeah.
And it'll look like they can't do either. So what you do is you separate them into two targets. The students will research about something, you know, using whatever your appropriate research tools are, library search or something like that. And then the second objective is the students will write an essay utilizing their research. So let's go back one more. I got it. Okay, in your subject area, write a sample of each of the 3 that I gave you. I'll go back to them. And then decide which you're most comfortable with. So you're gonna write 3 targets. They can be completely different, they can be different versions of the same one. And there's your samples.
You want us to construct 3 right now?
Mhm.
Okay. Three objectives.
Just make them up. Use last night's class.
You said 3, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
One of each. So let's get some examples out. Tessine, you got one?
Okay, well, you said we could use our last night's lesson
Mm-hmm.
as a guinea pig, and that's what I did. For example, did you want me to read all 3 of them?
Let's just do one.
Okay.
Just pick one.
All right. For instance, one that I could come up with was students comprehend Americans' relationships to food and their own social context.
Okay. So the students will comprehend.
Mm-hmm.
It's a synonym for know.
Know or understand.
Yeah. So it's a great start, okay?
Mhm.
But we'd circle that and we'd have to think, well, what exactly are they going to do so that you know they did comprehend it? Are they going to talk about it? Are they going to
That
write
is-
about it? Are
Exactly, hold on. That
Okay.
is number 3.
Oh, okay, so,
Yes,
okay.
yes, I did.
Give me number 3 then.
Yes.
Is it an
all right.
idea?
They will generate questions on a global level to appreciate how food connects people globally.
Okay. You've got 2 verbs in there. You've got
Yes.
generate, which you can see when they
and
actually
connect.
generate,
Uh-huh.
and you've got appreciate.
Appreciate.
How the hell will you know if they appreciate it?
Well, if they didn't, somewhere either I failed or,
They might hate it.
yeah,
You know, this is stupid.
You don't have to like everything.
exactly,
Okay, but you want them to appreciate it,
exactly.
okay? But they may not appreciate it. It's just a hard verb to measure. And, you know, we don't have to get our angels dancing on the head of this pin, right? So it's just food for thought,
Yes,
which is the title of your book, isn't
yeah,
it?
yes,
Okay.
the title of the extract.
Oh, okay. So, you know, you want to be careful what you're measuring. You're measuring.
Abstract goals.
Yeah, okay, and whether or not they can tie those things together, food and culture.
Mhm.
Okay. Vernon,
Just one.
just one.
Okay, upon completion of the course, students should be able to construct a circle graph, give it a compass, a protractor, and a ruler.
Okay, construct a social graph,
No, a circle graph,
circle graph,
yeah.
and I guess the last part.
Given a compass, protractor, and a ruler.
Okay. Very measurable.
Oh,
Is it terminal? I mean, is that something that you would consider the most essential thing in that circle? Down here?
uh-huh.
Or is that up here or here?
I think it's the basic of, I mean, it's something that they should know.
Okay, very well it might be. I'm just asking the question. I'm,
Yeah.
you know, not a math guy.
Could have used a computer to do it too, which is exactly what you did.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, sometimes, you know, like when you get to that, you know, comprehend question, it's like, well, how will I know they would comprehend? Well,
Yeah.
take a look at this
Exactly.
and,
Yeah.
you know, find a word.
Yeah. But don't you agree that in humanities, I think all goals are not very accessible and they're not always covering? You know, I mean, we can't crunch them into numbers.
Yeah.
Write a complete sentence.
Exactly.
Yes, I can. For accessible goals. Yes, I can.
Yeah, you know, my area is history, so, you know, there's a lot about history that it just isn't that important, but,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be nice if they knew it? Wouldn't it be nice if they knew how to do a civil dialogue?
Mhm.
we could have that debate, but I would suggest to you that, you know, here in the community college, we're not the university. So, you know, we're kind of poised someplace in between where, as they get out of high school, they really worked forever at the two lower levels of Bloom's, knowledge and comprehension.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
and they didn't master it very well, and who would? Because that's really boring stuff.
Mhm.
So we're going to move them into the other areas.
Other three.
And creating. Well, I've created a lot of things that weren't any darn good. How do we measure that? You know, I mean, I once worked with a professor whose area of expertise was creativity. And I asked her, how do you know? And her answer was, read my book.
Oh, okay.
Buy my book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty much what she said. We have to get them up there, you're right, okay. But somehow we need to have some kind of precision that as they're gonna leave here and move to Marshall State, West Virginia U, whatever, that we know that they're not just kind of dabbling, that they've got some expertise there. Okay, and we've got to somehow measure that. It's too easy for us to say, well, you know, we just need to have them think about stuff. Okay? We need to have them think about particular stuff. And then we need to have them do something with that thinking. So, only to a point. Okay. I was actually going to have everybody go up and give me a sample, and we'd kind of parse it out, but we're going to be short on time, so I'm going to move on. And I handed out kind of a blank format for a lesson plan. I'll use this or not, it doesn't matter. It's not the form that's really important, but this somehow provides a visual of where we're going to end up today, and so I wanted to introduce it now so that you kind of see that. The first box is just kind of this global box on the outside, and that's the learner. We spent some time on that and kind of learning who they are. We'll use that information as needed for each lesson, but we don't do it over for every lesson. You know, once we get that information, we add to it, but we don't have to redo it. The other part, the 3 boxes below, we do that on a class by class by class basis. And we're working now in the target box. You know, what do they need to know? And I really think we don't spend enough time on determining what that is. When I first started teaching in the 70s, I had not had a course in education, and I was teaching history, and I got 5 classes of world cultures. God, did I hate teaching that course, but it was a job. And so I went to my department chair and I said, well, just exactly what do I teach? And she handed me a textbook. And that's what we did in the 70s. And I was in California, I was in Los Angeles, and by the end of the 70s, the State Department of Education was publishing guidelines for schools. So there was a guideline for history and one for language, arts, science. You know, there was physical education, art, all of them. And they actually laid out exactly what a 12th grade student would know after going from K through 12th. So that helped. Now I knew, you know, what I needed to teach. And for most of my professional life, I've been working with those standards. And there's a lot of question about, and I think maybe this is where your question is coming from, Tassine, is don't we miss something if we standardize? I mean, really, we don't want to create little automatons coming out of our schools,
Right.
all of them being alike.
Exactly.
And yeah, you're right. But we've got to have some sort of a foundational, and that's probably what the standards are. The problem is that educators have used standards as the ceiling, not the floor. Okay? And, you know, here, we should view our targets as a floor. Many of our students are gonna go well past that. You know, they're gonna get into circle 2 and circle 3. But all of them have to master circle 1. We're gonna move to assessment. We're gonna think in terms of, okay, I don't know how I'm gonna get there yet, but I gotta figure out how I'll know if they are where I want them to go. And so we're gonna work on assessment. And then we'll take a look at the other part, which is, okay, what am I gonna do when the class starts, when the class is a third, fourth, fifth, all the way through to the end. So that takes me to assessment. There's 7 ways to gauge student mastery, which is like really cool that there's only 7 and not 107. And here they are. And I've got this sheet for you laid out so you can actually see it. But I thought this was cool. Okay, the first type is forced choice. This is what we do traditionally in our classes with tests. Multiple choice, true and false, fill in, those types of tests. What are the advantages of a forced choice test?
Well, for me, they're easier to grade,
Okay.
but I don't use them, but I do remember that.
Me too. I think that they don't achieve anything because it's an all or nothing kind of a thing.
Okay.
So you can give pretty quick feedback to students.
Mhm.
That would be an advantage to them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm forced to use this type of assessment method for final exams because of the times that they have moved up because the staff wants to take extra days off for Christmas.
Okay. Although you could move your final exam in stages before that. Doesn't have to be on that particular time, but and I think really you're saying the same thing as Brandon. It's quick and dirty. You know?
Yeah,
You
put it
also-
through the
you also-
Scantron and it does it for
An
you.
advantage to them too is there's usually a set number of choices, which allows for guessing that you may get lucky.
Mhm.
And
Well, your disadvantage is, there's only one right answer.
Mhm.
Exactly. So it's a
And
shooting
two of
an
them
arrow
look
in the
right.
dark, right?
And
And these are specifically designed to be, they gotta be hard.
Yeah.
Or it's not gonna mean anything.
Yeah, you know, people smarter than me that spend a lot of time on, you know, how you're supposed to do these say that you're supposed to have, you know,
One that's
they're called
obvious.
distractors, and you know, you've got the right answer, and you've got an answer that's very close, and you've got one that's totally impossible, and then you've got one that's somewhat related.
Yes.
And that's, you know, how they're supposed to address that. If you get a lot of people answering that outlier, then something went really askew in your teaching. So you get some feedback from that. That's a lot of work for an assessment that gives you so little back in terms of what they know and are able to do.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's a limited use for this, and we'll talk about it later. Essay. What are the advantages of an essay?
For me, I enjoy seeing their thought process more and their ability to arrange material
Mhm.
and even to follow directions.
Mhm.
If you're asking for a certain task to be performed and they're rambling or not,
Yep.
it's wonderful when they break your prompt apart methodically and they address each part. Or
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there's room for them to demonstrate their understanding of organization.
You can show me that you know something, even if you don't know everything.
Right,
Exactly.
and multiple choice tests are not very good at that.
No. No. I think it also gives them the ability to express their linguistic skills, vocabulary,
Mhm.
factual understanding, maybe even critical thinking.
Mhm. And they have to use more than 140 characters?
Yeah, at my stage, I always.
No, I would prefer you just get right to the point.
Three pages is the limit of
Mhm.
draft, and then you can go.
Mhm.
But,
And both of those work, and they're obviously driven by content.
Mhm.
If you're in language arts,
Mhm.
well, you know, the more language, the better. If you're in sciences, give me the science.
I want the
Exactly.
point.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
yeah.
What is the disadvantage?
They take longer to grade.
They do, they're
You
really
get a delay in the
time
feedback
consuming.
unless someone's
Exactly.
really quick and good at them.
And in
I
terms
often
of,
find on essay question, you've got students that will break their necks to try to use everything you had in the question, and they don't need it.
Mhm. And that's a skill that we can work with our students on that, and, you know, how to address an essay question. Using that
I give you the
spaghetti
construction.
approach where, you know, let's just throw everything I know against the wall and see if something sticks, is really difficult. Because they showed that they know they knew something. And if your objective is that do they know it? Well, they rang the bell.
Mhm.
Badly.
Sometimes I get answers that are actually correct, but I wasn't expecting.
Mhm. And that's kind of cool.
I like when that happens. It's kind of rare, but
Yeah.
it does happen. And I get answers that, oh, well, actually, that is right. I think.
Mhm. The other disadvantage is that when we get back to, you know, that initial activity that we did with, you know, looking at students, some students are just poor writers. And writing an essay actually gets in the way of having them demonstrate what they know and what they're able to do. When you know that, you can accommodate for that instead of just giving them a poor grade on the test. Because it's not the test grade that is the objective here.
Mhm.
It's the content and whether or not they know it. And you need to be able to get to that to determine whether in fact they do know it. Third, short answer, similar, but instead of writing a whole long narrative, they just write a short paragraph. The advantages, just to kind of move along a little more quickly, the advantages, of course, are that you can cover a lot of different content in different ways. It's a little easier for the student to just, you know, write that short response. They're easier to grade. In fact, if you've got, you know, 10 short answers, maybe you're only looking at 5 of them. Okay, you don't have to grade them all. Oral presentations, where the students actually stand up and do some sort of a demonstration, be perfect for a lab. You could do it as a role play.
Mhm.
You could do it as a reading,
Yes.
and you know, you can find out a lot by having the student do that. They're time consuming because, you know, 5 minutes for every student, 20 students. There's a number, but I don't know what it is. Next one is observation. While the students are doing something, you actually observe them, so there's a task to be performed, and you're looking to see if they can do the task. This would be perfect for a lab. If you were having them do research, you know, you're sitting there with a computer and you can watch them do it. A performance. This is more in your fine arts area, where they actually have to do some sort of a, you know, have to play an instrument, they have to draw, give a speech, give a, them, what they know, how they did, and so forth. I think you'll find that they're going to be harder on themselves than you ever would be. There is the occasional student that'll blow it off and just say, oh, I did great. But this needs some structure where they actually do answer some essential prompts in determining how they did. But they actually assign a grade. You can say, you know, if you earn an A, this is what you need to have accomplished. In other words, you give them a rubric, and they do their own assessment of their rubric. Go to the next one. I'm not going to go through all those. Okay, purposes of assessment. There's two purposes of assessment. The first one is a formative assessment. And I'm going to go through all these, get them out. You can monitor student progress toward learning. Are they getting it? You can provide feedback to the students. So, you know, as you're doing this formative assessment, you need to do a little bit more work here, or, you know, you got this part, move on to the next part, so you can give them some feedback. You can do check for understanding. I'll show you some quick and dirty ways to do that. Here you use small chunks of learning. So one type of formative assessment that the forced choice example prior is useful on is this one. Give them a little quiz on just a small chunk of what we're working on. So you don't give them 75 multiple choice questions, you give them 5. And from that, you'll determine whether or not they're getting it. Formative assessment also gives you feedback about your teaching. If formatively you're finding out, you know, 19 of your 20 students are clueless, the problem isn't with 19 students. The problem is with the one person in the room who doesn't get it, the teacher. And you've got to fix that. And formatively, you can do that. Formative assessments are not graded. That would be very similar to spring training for all the baseball teams. And when they go into the season, they all have a grade that they take with them, and they start from there. We don't do that. Okay? We start over. You want to give students an opportunity to think, risk, take time, and if all students can learn, but not in the same way and not on the same day, if you give a formative assessment and you grade it, I may not get it yet, but I'll get it eventually. What we're looking at in formative assessment is the process. Are they engaged in the process of learning? The other purpose of assessment is summative assessment. And this is traditionally where we go as teachers. We tend not to do this, well, we do it, but we think it's over there. This is where you evaluate learning at the end of the lesson. So if it's a unit or a chapter or something like that, or a reading, then here is where you're going to do some sort of end of the unit assessment. You can compare your learning against a target. So you've written your target, and now the student does that final assessment, and you're looking at the two of them. Did they reach the target? You use a large amount of content here. It's the whole unit. When I was in college, and I'm sure this is true of you, we had 2 tests. We had a midterm and a final, and a project, and that was it. And we typically don't do that now. We kind of measure along the way, which is more formative, okay? And here we assign a grade. And this is product driven. What questions do you have about these 2 types of assessment? We mix them, and they're really done for different purposes, and they need to be held apart. Look a little bit more at this, some examples. So for formative assessment, a thumbs up, thumbs down, or on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being you're clueless about, we just talked about this last hour. 5 is I got it, ready to move on. Show me where you are. And every student in the class holds up a 1 or a 3 or a 5, and you scan to determine whether you need to go back and reteach, or everybody's got it, quit beating that horse, move on. You'll also find that you'll find courses, everybody's doing this, you're ready to move on, except for, Nathan back there, and Nathan's going, well, you can move on, but I gotta get to Nathan. So he and I are gonna meet, do some tutoring, whatever, and I'm gonna get him out, okay? Classroom polls, you can do this electronically with your smartphone. Every student has a smartphone. You do poll everywhere. I did that in Gov Day, if you remember. You just ask the question and everybody punches in an answer, and you watch it on the screen as the results come in. It's really useful. And there's lots of different kind of iterations of that. Corners. This is a neat one because, and you're all feeling this now. You've been sitting here almost 2 hours, and you're like ready to move. Well, not yet. But if we were doing corners, every corner of the room would be a different answer. What's your favorite season? Okay, winter, spring, fall, summer. And everybody would get up and they'd move to the appropriate corner. And you can see by the response, that was kind of a dumb one, right? But you can see from the response whether the students are getting the right answers. You can also carry that a little further, because when they're standing there in a little clump of students, they talk about, why did I pick this corner? What made this corner the right corner for me? And why am I not in that corner where more people are? Okay? So that's a good one. Doing a quick write. I think we've done that too at the last Gov Day, where you give them a minute, minute and a half. 2 minutes is too long. And they actually put their pen in the paper and they keep moving it until the time is up. And if they don't have anything to say, they write that. I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to say. And cognitively, we hate that. And so we find something to say. The quiz, I talked about that. And exit and entry tickets, and you're going to do that in a minute. Summative assessment, midterm exams, end of the unit exam, final paper or project, and standardized tests. And again, here we're looking at process, and here we're looking at product.
Well, I have a course that's very product driven. Anatomy and physiology is very product driven. I've got to build nurses. I've got to build people who are going into nursing. And you've got to be able to hack it. You've got to be.
I'm not exactly following, because that's not your target.
I have a product that I'm producing.
So he's.
But I'm down at the instructional level. So if they have to, I don't know, do some sort of a combination of chemicals or whatever to instruct or to treat a patient, your objective isn't this nurse thing. Your objective is, can they do the appropriate mixture? Okay, and the product is the mixture. Did they do it right? 'Cause I don't have a better example because it's not an area in which I'm particularly comfortable. But don't be thinking that far out. thinking about, you know, the 2 hours I'm gonna spend with them. So, you know, here at the activity, that's the long sheet. This is where you're gonna spend most of your time in the class. And this is kind of where we tend to spend our time planning. You know, it's kind of like, Monday, I got class on Monday, what the heck am I gonna have the students do? Well, once you have a target, that's an easier question to answer. And if you have a target and assessment, it's a really easy question to answer. Some things to consider about your activity side. First of all, you want to start with the target for your students. Remember, share it with them. So either write it on the board, you know, have it there, you know, when they come in, you know, whether it's an essential question or whatever, it's right there in front of them. So start with that. Even if you just say, you know, today when you leave, I want you to be able to do whatever. Begin every lesson with a hook. What's a hook? It's an introduction. I did. You know, that stupid little Abbott and Costello thing was kind of cute. Added absolutely nothing to the lesson except got us together. Okay? There's different hooks that you can use. Videos are always great, and YouTube's got them all. If in social studies, if we're doing the American Revolution and you have an old you know, flintlock rifle, bring that in and show them. I was never the kind of social studies teacher that felt very comfortable coming in uniform or costume. Many do. If we're studying, you know, westward migration, and today's lesson is early pioneers like Daniel Boone, you be him. Okay? That'd be a great hook. Use multiple learning modalities. We tend to fall back on lecture because that's how we were taught, especially at the college level. And lectures are fine. You can cover a lot of information in a relatively short period of time, but you have to make them interactive. And when you do that, then you're taking that auditory modality and adding kinesthetic or visual, and that helps your students. Use effective brain-based strategies. Novelty is, the brain craves novelty. By the way, the brain craves challenge also, and there's kind of a narrow window. When the material is too easy for the students, they're not learning. When the material is too hard for the students, they're not learning. When the material is an appropriate challenge for the students, then they get into a learning mode, and they get into what's called flow, and they can learn best there. And use formative assessment strategies often. And again, monitoring whether they're coming with you, or are you just throwing the stuff out and nobody's getting it. Provide opportunities for student choice. Instead of having one assignment that everybody has to do, have 3, and they get to choose. When students feel empowered by doing choice, having choice in their activities, they do better. And I couldn't stress more strongly, this includes summative assessments. Set high targets and expectations. Gets to that challenge. Balance novelty and predictability. And prepare the student for a summative assessment. So if the summative assessment is an essay, and you're assuming that the English teachers have taken care of that, you'll be disappointed. Often students did learn it in English, but they don't understand how to bring those skills to the social studies or the math classroom. And so when you say you're going to have an essay test in math, you're going to have to tell them how they're going to actually be successful in addressing that essay. So prepare them for that assessment. All right. I'm going to give you a half sheet of paper, and this is your exit ticket, and we will be done for today. And I want 3 things on here. 3 things you found helpful in today's workshop. 2 questions that come to mind from today's workshop. And 1 thing you're going to try immediately that we introduced. And when you've done that, we will be done.
So are you gonna have more of these?
Again.
Okay.
Fortunately, I didn't exhaust all the stuff I could say. Thanks.
Can I show you something? Or you want to wait till this is over? I'm just gonna talk to you about that. Here's this. And this is our goals. And it's got understand.